When single mother Emily Dawson stepped into the courtroom, she wasn't just fighting for her home, she was taking on a powerful landlord who thought he was untouchable. Richard Lawson had built an empire by bending the law in his favor, forcing tenants out to maximize his profits. But this time, he picked the wrong person to intimidate. With hidden recordings, shocking testimonies, and a courtroom battle filled with unexpected twists, Emily's case would unravel more than just one eviction. It would expose a pattern of corruption no one saw coming. But could she really win against a man who had money, power, and influence on his side? Or would the system fail her like so many others before? Stay tuned to find out, and before we begin, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel for more gripping stories of justice, redemption, and the truth coming to light. Emily Dawson took a deep breath and stepped into the courtroom. Her hands clutched a small notebook filled with notes, reminders, and one simple but powerful goal: fight for her home. The large wooden doors closed behind her with a heavy thud, sealing her inside with her biggest challenge yet. Across the room, Richard Lawson, her landlord, sat confidently with his expensive lawyer, Gregory Marks. Emily had seen men like Richard before, wealthy, powerful, and convinced that the law would always be on their side. He wore a smug smirk, as if this court trial was nothing more than an inconvenience in his otherwise perfect life. The judge entered, and the court session began. Emily's lawyer, Jake Miller, was young but sharp. He adjusted his tie and stood up to address the court. "Your Honor, my client Emily Dawson has been unlawfully evicted from her apartment with no prior notice, violating tenant protection laws." Richard's lawyer scoffed. "Objection. Miss Dawson was informed in advance. She failed to pay rent on time multiple times. The eviction was justified." Emily clenched her fists. This was a lie, and she had proof. But she needed to wait for the right moment. The court proceedings continued, with Richard's team presenting documents that seemed to favor their side. The judge turned to Emily. "Miss Dawson, do you have any evidence to support your claims?" Emily took a deep breath, reached into her bag, and pulled out a small USB drive. She handed it to Jake, who plugged it into a laptop. "Your Honor, this is a recording of a conversation between my client and Mr. Lawson," Jake announced. A hushed murmur spread through the courtroom as the audio played. "I don't care what the law says," Richard's voice sneered through the speakers. "If you don't do what I ask you and your kid are out. I have ways of making people disappear from my buildings." Gasps filled the courtroom. The judge's eyes narrowed. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Jake turned to the judge. "This proves that Mr. Lawson's actions were personal, not legal. He threatened my client because she refused to be his private maid." Richard's lawyer tried to object, but the judge silenced him. "This is serious. We will review this evidence thoroughly before making any judgments." Emily felt a flicker of hope. For the first time since this ordeal began, the court case was swinging in her favor. But little did she know this was just the beginning. A tense silence settled over the courtroom as the recording finished playing. Emily stole a glance at Richard Lawson. His confident smirk had disappeared, replaced by clenched teeth and narrowed eyes. His lawyer, Gregory Marks, quickly stood. "Your Honor," Gregory said, forcing calm into his voice. "This recording is incomplete. There is no context. It could have been manipulated." Emily's lawyer, Jake Miller, didn't miss a beat. "Then, let's examine the full conversation." He clicked on the file again. The next part of the audio played. Richard's voice came through. "Listen, Emily. You don't have a lease renewal unless I say so. If you want to stay, you'll have to do something for me." Emily's own voice was clear. "Are you saying you'll evict me unless I agree to work as your housekeeper for free?" Richard laughed in the recording. "Call it what you want, but you don't have much of a choice, do you?" A loud murmur rippled through the courtroom. Even the judge, a seasoned man in his 60s, looked disturbed. He adjusted his glasses and turned toward Richard. "Mr. Lawson, is this your voice in the recording?" Richard hesitated. Then, for the first time, he faltered. It, it could be, but that doesn't mean. The judge raised a hand, silencing him. I've heard enough. We will have an expert analyze this recording, but on the surface, it appears quite damaging to your case. Emily exhaled slowly, gripping the table in front of her. For the first time since this battle began, the court trial was shifting in her favor. But she knew Richard Lawson wasn't the kind of man who gave up easily. As if on cue, Gregory Marks cleared his throat. Your Honor, even if this recording is real, we must examine the financial situation of Miss Dawson. She has struggled to pay rent on time. That, in itself, is grounds for eviction. Emily tensed. She had expected this argument. Jake stood confidently. Miss Dawson, do you have proof that you paid your rent on time? Emily pulled out a stack of neatly organized receipts. She had prepared for this. She had anticipated Richard's lies. Jake handed them to the judge. Here are the official receipts from the apartment management company, confirming that Miss Dawson has never been late on a single payment. Gregory quickly scanned the receipts, his expression darkening. He whispered something to Richard, who was now tapping his fingers rapidly against the table. Emily watched Richard carefully. He wasn't panicking, at least not yet. He still had something up his sleeve. The judge finished looking over the receipts. It seems Miss Dawson has, in fact, paid rent on time. Mr. Lawson, do you have any further justification for her eviction? Richard's lips curled into a smirk. Actually, Your Honor, I do. Emily's stomach dropped. Richard reached into his briefcase and pulled out a document. This is the original lease agreement Miss Dawson signed. It includes a clause that states the landlord has the right to refuse renewal at their discretion. Jake took the document and quickly skimmed it. Emily could see his jaw tighten. Your Honor, Jake said carefully, this clause may be legally valid, but combined with the audio recording, it's clear that Mr. Lawson used it to manipulate my client. The judge nodded slowly. This case is no longer just about a lease agreement. The court must determine if Mr. Lawson acted in bad faith. Richard's smirk returned. He leaned back in his chair, looking relaxed. He had managed to buy himself time. Emily's heart pounded. She had landed her first punch, but this fight was far from over. The battle in the courtroom was just beginning. Emily's pulse quickened as the courtroom settled into an uneasy silence. Richard Lawson had just played his card, the lease agreement that granted him the right to refuse renewal. But Emily knew this wasn't about a simple lease. This was about power, manipulation, and justice. The judge studied the document before looking at Jake. Mr. Miller, your client's lease does include this clause. Do you have grounds to argue against its enforcement? Jake took a steady breath. Yes, Your Honor. While the clause may be legal, its application in this case was not. The recording we played earlier proves Mr. Lawson's true intentions. He wasn't enforcing the lease in good faith. He was using it as a weapon to coerce Miss Dawson. Richard's lawyer, Gregory Marks, scoffed. That's speculation. The court cannot make a decision based on assumptions. Jake didn't flinch. It's not an assumption. We have more evidence. Emily turned toward Jake, startled. More evidence? Jake reached into his briefcase and pulled out a printed email. Your Honor, this is an email from Mr. Lawson to his property manager, dated 2 months before Miss Dawson's eviction notice. In it, he explicitly states that he intends to force her out, so he can rent the unit at a higher price. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Even the judge's expression darkened as he read the email aloud. I don't care what the current tenant thinks. I can get nearly double for that unit. Let's make sure she's gone before the end of the lease. Emily watched Richard closely. His smirk had disappeared, replaced by clenched fists. Gregory stood quickly. Your Honor, this email does not prove wrongdoing. A landlord has the right to maximize his profits. The judge sighed. While that may be true, the court must also consider the pattern of behavior. So far, the evidence suggests Mr. Lawson acted with malice. Jake leaned forward. "And we're not done, Your Honor." Emily's eyes widened. What else had Jake prepared? Jake turned toward the courtroom doors. "Your Honor, we have a witness who can testify to Mr. Lawson's unethical practices." The doors opened, and a woman walked in mid-40s, dressed in a conservative blazer, her expression unreadable. Gregory's face paled. Richard's expression hardened. "Miss Claire Matthews," Jake introduced. "Former assistant to Mr. Lawson." Claire took the witness stand and was sworn in. Jake approached her. "Miss Matthews, can you describe your role while working for Mr. Lawson?" Claire folded her hands. "I was his personal assistant for 5 years. I handled property paperwork, tenant complaints, and lease renewals." Jake nodded. "Did you ever witness Mr. Lawson engage in unethical behavior?" Claire hesitated, then took a deep breath. "Yes. Many times. He instructed me to falsify late payment notices for tenants he wanted to remove. He also had me forge lease violation letters to pressure people into leaving. And in Miss Dawson's case," she swallowed hard, "he specifically told me to make sure she felt uncomfortable enough to move out on her own." A collective gasp filled the courtroom. Richard shot up from his chair. "This is ridiculous. She's lying." The judge banged his gavel. "Order in the court." Jake kept his composure. "Miss Matthews, do you have proof of these claims?" Claire reached into her bag and pulled out a stack of documents. "I kept copies. Emails, text messages, even handwritten notes from Mr. Lawson, instructing me to fabricate tenant complaints." Jake took the documents and handed them to the judge. "Your Honor, this confirms a pattern of unethical and possibly illegal conduct." The judge's face was unreadable as he examined the papers. Then he looked at Richard. "Mr. Lawson, these allegations are serious. The court will need time to review this new evidence." Emily exhaled, barely believing what had just happened. She had come into this court case thinking she was alone. Now, it was clear others had suffered too, and the courtroom was beginning to see the truth. Richard, however, wasn't done fighting. He adjusted his suit and leaned toward his lawyer, whispering something. Emily knew one thing, for sure this battle was far from over. Richard Lawson sat stiffly at the defendant's table, his jaw tight as the judge examined the damning documents provided by Claire Matthews. The once smug landlord was losing ground fast, and the courtroom could feel it. Emily Dawson stole a glance at her lawyer, Jake Miller. He sat with his fingers interlocked, his expression calm but calculating. She knew he was already planning his next move. The judge finally set the documents down. "This is serious evidence of fraudulent activity, Mr. Lawson," he said. "The court will take this into consideration as we move forward." Richard cleared his throat. "Your Honor, this woman Claire Matthews was fired from my company. She has every reason to lie out of spite." Jake immediately responded, "Actually, Your Honor, Miss Matthews was not fired. She resigned. And we have proof." Jake pulled out another document, a resignation letter signed by Claire herself. She left because she refused to participate in Mr. Lawson's illegal activities. And she even sent a report to the Housing Authority, which mysteriously never led to an investigation. Richard shifted in his seat, but his lawyer, Gregory Marks, stood with practiced ease. "Your Honor, while these allegations are troubling, they are still just allegations. I move to dismiss all testimony from Miss Matthews until further review." Emily's stomach twisted. If the court dismissed Claire's testimony, they would lose a critical piece of their case. The judge rubbed his chin in thought, then turned to Claire. "Miss Matthews, are you willing to testify under oath that these statements are true?" Claire met the judge's gaze steadily. "Yes, Your Honor. Everything I have said is the truth." The judge nodded. "Then the court will accept your testimony for now. However, we will need further corroboration before making a ruling on these claims." Jake leaned forward. "We have more, Your Honor." Richard let out a sharp breath. "Of course you do," he muttered under his breath. Jake ignored him and turned to the courtroom doors. We have another witness. The doors swung open. A man in his late 30s walked in, dressed in a crisp suit, but looking visibly nervous. He adjusted his tie as he made his way to the witness stand. Jake introduced him. This is David Kent, a former tenant of Mr. Lawson's buildings. He was evicted under circumstances similar to Miss Dawson's. Richard's face darkened. David took his seat and was sworn in. Jake wasted no time. Mr. Kent, can you describe your experience with Mr. Lawson's property management? David hesitated, then nodded. I lived in one of his apartment buildings for 3 years. Paid rent on time, followed all the rules. Then, out of nowhere, I got an eviction notice. When I asked why, they claimed I had multiple noise complaints, which was a lie. I lived alone and barely even had visitors. The courtroom murmured with interest. Jake pressed on. Did you ever see any official reports about these noise complaints? David shook his head. No. And when I requested proof, they told me it was confidential. Then, after I left, I found out my old unit was listed online for twice the price I was paying. Jake turned to the judge. Your Honor, this is another example of Mr. Lawson using fabricated reasons to push tenants out for profit. Gregory Marks stood abruptly. This is a distraction. None of this changes the fact that Miss Dawson's lease expired, and Mr. Lawson had the legal right to remove her. Emily tensed. Was Gregory really going to ignore all the evidence? The judge held up a hand. Mr. Marks, the court is not blind to patterns of misconduct. We will review all presented testimonies before making any conclusions. Richard leaned in close to his lawyer and whispered something. Gregory nodded before addressing the judge. Your Honor, we request a recess before continuing. The judge considered for a moment, then nodded. Very well. The court will reconvene in 1 hour. Emily exhaled, her heart still racing. She had expected a battle, but this was turning into an all-out war. As she gathered her things, she caught a glimpse of Richard. He was no longer smirking, but the calculating glint in his eyes told her something was coming. The courtroom battle was far from over. The courtroom had emptied for recess, but Emily Dawson remained seated at the plaintiff's table, her fingers gripping the edge of her chair. Her lawyer, Jake Miller, paced beside her, his expression thoughtful. Across the room, Richard Lawson and his attorney, Gregory Marks, whispered in hushed voices. He's up to something, Emily murmured. Jake stopped pacing. Of course he is. He's losing, and men like him don't lose quietly. The hour passed quickly, and soon the court was back in session. The judge took his seat and adjusted his glasses. We will now proceed with the case. Mr. Marks, you may continue your defense. Gregory stood confidently. Your Honor, while the testimony given earlier was compelling, none of it changes the fact that Miss Dawson's lease legally expired. We argue that all evidence beyond the lease agreement is irrelevant to this case and should be dismissed. Emily's stomach twisted. If the court agreed, all their hard work would be undone in an instant. Jake immediately rose. Your Honor, I strongly object. The testimonies we provided reveal a pattern of fraud and intimidation by Mr. Lawson. The court has an obligation to consider whether my client was evicted under dishonest pretenses. The judge nodded. The court will not dismiss the evidence at this time. However, I need something more concrete before making a ruling on bad faith eviction. Richard leaned forward, a smirk returning to his lips. Then allow me to clarify things, Your Honor. Jake tensed as Richard stood and adjusted his suit. Miss Dawson claims I forced her out unjustly, but let's examine her own conduct as a tenant. I have here an official complaint filed against her by a neighbor. Gregory handed a document to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. Emily's pulse pounded in her ears. The judge read aloud. On multiple occasions, Miss Dawson was heard arguing loudly with her son at late hours, causing distress to other residents. Several complaints were made to management, requesting intervention. A shocked murmur spread through the courtroom. Emily's face burned. She turned to Jake, whispering, "That's not true." Jake's jaw was tight. "I know, but we have to prove it." Gregory smiled smugly. "This complaint is dated 2 months before the eviction notice. If Miss Dawson was truly an ideal tenant, why would a neighbor be driven to file a formal report?" The judge looked at Emily. "Miss Dawson, how do you respond to this?" Emily swallowed hard. "It's a lie, Your Honor. My son and I never had loud arguments. We live a quiet life." Jake stood. "Your Honor, we need to verify this complaint. I request a subpoena for the apartment management records to determine if any other complaints exist against Miss Dawson." The judge nodded. "That is a reasonable request. The court will review the official records." Gregory's smile faltered. He had expected Emily to crumble under the accusation. Instead, she was fighting back. The bailiff left to retrieve the files, and an uneasy silence settled over the courtroom. Richard's fingers drummed against the table. Minutes later, the bailiff returned and handed a folder to the judge. He flipped through the pages, his brows furrowing. "This is interesting," the judge mused. "According to these records, there is only one complaint filed against Miss Dawson, and it was written by a tenant who moved out immediately after." Jake smirked. "Your Honor, I suspect this so-called neighbor was a fabricated witness. And if that's the case, then we have yet another example of Mr. Lawson's attempts to manipulate the court." The judge closed the folder. "This does raise concerns." He turned to Richard. "Mr. Lawson, do you have any proof that this complaint was legitimate?" Richard hesitated, then shook his head. The judge sighed. "Then I will disregard it from the record. Mr. Miller, you may proceed." Emily exhaled in relief. Another attack deflected, but she knew Richard had more tricks. As the court case continued, she braced herself for whatever came next. Emily Dawson's fingers trembled slightly as she gripped the edge of the plaintiff's table. The fabricated complaint had been dismissed, but she knew Richard Lawson wouldn't stop there. Across the courtroom, he sat stiffly, whispering furiously with his lawyer, Gregory Marks. Jake Miller leaned in close to Emily. "He's getting desperate. That was a weak move and it backfired. We need to push harder." Emily nodded, her heart pounding. "What's our next step?" Jake stood, addressing the judge. "Your Honor, I would like to call a final witness to testify regarding Mr. Lawson's history of misconduct in property management." The judge adjusted his glasses. "Proceed." The courtroom doors opened, and a teenage boy walked in. He was tall, lanky, no older than 15, and had a nervous but determined look on his face. Emily's breath hitched. "Her son, Noah." Richard stiffened, eyes narrowing. Noah walked to the witness stand and was sworn in. He sat upright, his hands clasped together, mirroring the quiet strength Emily had always admired in him. Jake approached. "Noah, can you tell the court about your experience with Mr. Lawson?" Noah took a steady breath. "A few months before we were evicted, Mr. Lawson came to our apartment while my mom wasn't home. He told me we needed to leave soon and that it was just business." A murmur spread through the courtroom. The judge leaned forward. "Did he threaten you directly?" Noah hesitated, then nodded. "Not in words, but he made it clear we wouldn't have a choice. He also told me not to tell my mom." Emily's stomach twisted. She had known Richard was ruthless, but this? Threatening a child? Jake continued. "And do you have proof of this conversation?" Noah reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "I recorded it." Gasps filled the courtroom. Richard shot up from his seat. "Objection. This is outrageous." The judge held up a hand. "Mr. Lawson, sit down." Noah handed the phone to Jake, who connected it to the speakers. Richard's voice crackled through the courtroom. "Listen, kid. I don't care how long you've lived here. It's over. Your mom can fight all she wants, but she won't win. The sooner you both accept that, the easier this will be. You understand?" Silence. Then, Noah's voice shaky but defiant. My mom pays rent on time. You can't just kick us out. A low chuckle from Richard. Oh, but I can. I do it all the time. The courtroom erupted. The judge banged his gavel. Order in the court. Emily couldn't breathe. The whole room was spinning. She reached for Noah's hand, squeezing it tightly. Jake's voice rang out. Your Honor, this is undeniable proof that Mr. Lawson knowingly and aggressively pressured my client's family into leaving under false pretenses. This is no longer just about a lease. This is about abuse of power. The judge turned to Richard, his expression unreadable. Mr. Lawson, do you have anything to say in your defense? Richard clenched his jaw, gripping the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. For the first time, he had no words. The tide had turned. The court case was nearing its conclusion. The courtroom was electric with tension. Richard Lawson, the once confident landlord, sat frozen, his face drained of color. Across from him, Emily Dawson clutched her son Noah's hand, her heart pounding. The audio recording had shattered Richard's defense, exposing his blatant intimidation tactics. The judge's gaze was steely as he turned to Richard. Mr. Lawson, this recording suggests you intentionally pressured Miss Dawson's family to leave under dishonest pretenses. Do you deny this? Richard's jaw twitched. His lawyer, Gregory Marks, quickly rose. Your Honor, while the recording may seem damaging, we argue that it was taken out of context. Mr. Lawson was simply informing the tenant of the legal realities of her lease expiration. Jake Miller scoffed. Informing? That was a threat. He stepped forward. Your Honor, let's look at the full picture. First, we have a secret email from Mr. Lawson to his management team, proving he intended to push Miss Dawson out purely for profit. Then, we have multiple testimonies from tenants and employees exposing his history of fraud. And now, we have a direct recording of him intimidating a minor. Jake turned to the jury, letting the words sink in. Mr. Lawson abused his power. This isn't about rent payments. It's about manipulation, greed, and coercion. A murmur spread through the courtroom. The weight of the evidence was undeniable. Richard exhaled sharply and shot a glare at Gregory. His lawyer wiped his brow, then turned to the judge. Your Honor, we request a recess to reassess our strategy. The judge held up a hand. Denied. We've given this case ample time, and the court is ready to proceed. Gregory opened his mouth, then shut it. He knew they were cornered. Richard suddenly stood, his chair scraping against the polished floor. This is ridiculous. You're all acting like I committed some crime. He gestured wildly. I followed the lease. She had no right to stay. The judge's voice remained firm. And yet, the court has seen substantial evidence suggesting bad faith eviction. Your behavior has called the legality of your actions into question. Jake pressed his advantage. Your Honor, based on the evidence presented, we request a formal review of all evictions conducted by Mr. Lawson in the past 5 years. If a pattern of fraud is confirmed, we will seek full legal consequences. The courtroom erupted again. Richard's face turned red. You can't do that. The judge banged his gavel. I can and I will. His eyes locked onto Richard. The court takes landlord-tenant laws very seriously. If the evidence supports misconduct, you may face serious penalties, including financial restitution and potential criminal charges. Richard's breath came in quick bursts. His empire, his carefully crafted web of deception, was crumbling before his eyes. Emily felt Noah squeeze her hand. She looked at him, seeing the same quiet strength that had carried them through this nightmare. They were winning. The judge straightened. This court will reconvene tomorrow for closing arguments. Until then, I strongly advise both parties to consider their positions carefully. With that, the session ended. Emily stood, her legs weak but steady. As she gathered her things, she saw Richard staring at her, his expression unreadable. For the first time, he looked unsure. The battle in the courtroom was nearly over. But one final confrontation remained. The courtroom was quieter than usual the next morning. The tension was suffocating. This was at the day of closing arguments, the day the battle would be won or lost. Emily Dawson sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Noah sat beside her, his gaze steady. He had been strong throughout this trial, but she could see the exhaustion in his eyes. This fight had taken a toll on both of them. Across the room, Richard Lawson was not the same man who had walked into the courtroom days ago with arrogance and certainty. His suit was still pristine, his hair still neatly combed, but there was something missing his confidence. He knew, just as everyone in this room knew, that his position had been fatally weakened. The judge entered, and the bailiff called the court to order. We will now hear closing statements. Mr. Miller, you may begin. Jake Miller stood, adjusting his tie. He turned to the jury, his voice measured but firm. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about more than a lease agreement. It is about fairness. It is about power. It is about the law. He paced slowly in front of them. Mr. Lawson claims he acted legally, that this eviction was simply business. But what have we seen? A secret email proving his real motive. Testimonies from former employees and tenants exposing his pattern of fraud. A recorded conversation where he intimidated a child into silence. Jake paused, letting the words settle. The courtroom was silent, every eye on him. Richard Lawson is a man who thought he could manipulate the system, who believed his wealth and power made him untouchable. But the law is not written for the powerful alone. It is written for everyone. And today, you have the chance to prove that. He turned to Emily. Miss Dawson has done everything right. She paid her rent on time. She followed the rules. And yet, she was forced out of her home not because of anything she did wrong, but because of one man's greed. Jake faced the jury again. Do not let this go unpunished. Send a message that no one, no matter how rich or powerful, is above the law. He nodded, then took his seat. Emily let out a shaky breath. It was a strong closing, but now it was the defense's turn. Gregory Mark stood, buttoning his jacket. Ladies and gentlemen, my client, Mr. Lawson, is not perfect. He is a businessman, and like all businessmen, he makes decisions that benefit his investments. That does not make him a criminal. He glanced toward Richard. The opposing counsel wants you to believe that Mr. Lawson acted with malicious intent. But let's be honest, he simply exercised his right as a landlord. Miss Dawson's lease expired. He had every legal right to refuse renewal. That is not fraud. That is not intimidation. That is just business. Gregory spread his hands. At the end of the day, you must ask yourselves, was a law broken? And if not, does this court have the right to punish a man for running his business? He sat down, looking pleased with himself. Emily swallowed hard. Gregory was smart. He was shifting the argument from morality to legality. The judge straightened. We will now take a short recess before delivering the verdict. The jury will deliberate. As the jury filed out, Emily's heart pounded. This was it. The courtroom battle was over. Now it was in the jury's hands. The courtroom was heavy with anticipation. The jury had been deliberating for nearly 2 hours, and every passing minute felt like an eternity. Emily Dawson sat still, her fingers intertwined, gripping tightly onto herself as if holding everything together. Noah sat beside her, silent but watchful. Across the room, Richard Lawson tapped his fingers rhythmically against the defense table. His lawyer, Gregory Marks, whispered something to him, but Richard didn't react. His once unshakable confidence had been replaced with cold calculation. He was waiting just like everyone else. The door at the side of the courtroom opened, and the bailiff stepped inside. All rise. Emily's heart pounded. This was it. The jury had reached a decision. The 12 jurors filed in, their expressions unreadable. The foreman, A woman in her 50s with sharp eyes stood with a sheet of paper in her hand. The judge nodded. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." Emily inhaled sharply. The paper was handed to the judge, who scanned it before looking back at the jury. "Please read your decision." The foreman cleared her throat. "In the matter of Dawson versus Lawson, on the charge of wrongful eviction, we find the defendant guilty." The courtroom erupted in gasps and whispers. Emily's vision blurred with unshed tears. She gripped the edge of the table, barely able to breathe. She had won. Richard shot up from his seat. "This is ridiculous." The judge banged his gavel. "Order in the court." Richard turned to his lawyer, his face red with fury. "Do something?" Gregory sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. He had lost and he knew it. "Mr. Lawson, sit down." The judge continued, his voice firm. "The court finds that Mr. Lawson engaged in bad faith eviction practices, knowingly manipulated legal loopholes for financial gain, and used intimidation tactics against tenants. Therefore, this court orders the following. Mr. Lawson must pay financial damages to Miss Dawson, including compensation for emotional distress and moving expenses. Additionally, a full audit of Mr. Lawson's rental properties will be conducted to ensure further illegal evictions have not taken place." Emily's breath hitched. This was bigger than just her case. This ruling would impact dozens, maybe hundreds of other tenants Richard had wronged. The judge's gaze landed on Richard. "If further violations are discovered, criminal charges may be pursued. Consider this ruling a warning." Richard's face twisted in fury. "This is outrageous. You can't do this." The judge's expression didn't waver. "This court can and has. Mr. Lawson, you are dismissed." With one final bang of the gavel, the courtroom erupted again, this time in victory. Emily turned to Jake, her breath shaky. "Did that really just happen?" Jake grinned. "It did." Noah threw his arms around his mother, and she held him tight. They had fought. They had won. As they gathered their things, Emily glanced back one last time. Richard stood frozen, his empire crumbling around him. For the first time, he looked powerless. Justice had been served. The courtroom doors swung open, and Emily Dawson stepped outside into the crisp autumn air. The case was over. The weight she had carried for months, no, years, had finally lifted. The victory was real. Justice had been served. But even as she breathed in the fresh air, she knew this wasn't just her fight. This was bigger than her. Noah walked beside her, his backpack slung over his shoulder, his face a mixture of exhaustion and quiet relief. He had stood beside her through it all. He had faced Richard Lawson in the court and helped bring him down. She squeezed his hand, silently telling him how proud she was. Jake Miller caught up with them, still holding his briefcase. "I hope you're ready," he said with a smirk, "because this case is making headlines. Reporters are already waiting outside the building." Emily sighed. She had spent weeks fighting in the courtroom, bearing her soul in front of strangers. Now, the world wanted to know her story. Before she could respond, the doors behind them slammed open. Richard Lawson stormed out, his lawyer Gregory Marks trailing behind him. His face was tight with barely contained rage, but there was something else, an edge of desperation. His empire, built on greed and intimidation, was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He spotted Emily and froze. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. Emily expected him to spit some final insult, to sneer, to remind her that men like him always landed on their feet. Instead, to her shock, he sighed. "You won," he muttered. His voice was hoarse, as if admitting those two words cost him something vital. Emily studied him. He wasn't the invincible landlord anymore. He was just a man who had finally faced the consequences of his actions. She met his gaze. "No, Mr. Lawson." Justice won. His jaw tightened, and for a brief second, it looked like he wanted to argue. But instead he turned away and disappeared down the courthouse steps. Gregory stayed behind for a moment, adjusting his tie awkwardly. "For what it's worth," he said, "not all landlords are like him." Emily tilted her head. "No, but enough of them are." Gregory exhaled, nodded, and walked off, leaving Emily, Noah, and Jake standing alone. "Well," Jake said, shaking his head, "that was dramatic." Emily let out a short laugh, not out of humor, but out of sheer disbelief that it was finally over. Just then, a voice called out, "Miss Dawson." She turned to see a reporter rushing toward her, microphone in hand, followed by a cameraman. "Miss Dawson, how do you feel about today's ruling?" Emily took a deep breath. She could walk away. She didn't owe anyone a statement. But this wasn't just about her. She squared her shoulders. "I feel relieved. I feel grateful. And I feel hopeful." The reporter leaned in. "What message do you think this case sends to tenants facing unfair evictions?" Emily met the camera's lens head-on. That they are not powerless. That they can fight back. And that sometimes, just sometimes, the court really does stand for justice. The reporter nodded, satisfied, and turned to interview Jake. Noah nudged his mom's side. "Does this mean we don't have to move again?" Emily smiled, ruffling his hair. "That's exactly what it means." For the first time in a long time, their home was safe. Their future was their own. And as they walked down the courthouse steps, Emily Dawson knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together. Justice had been served, and a new beginning had just begun. As Emily Dawson walked away from the courtroom, she wasn't just leaving behind a legal battle, she was stepping into a future she had fought for. This case proved that standing up for what's right can change everything. What do you think about this story? Have you or someone you know ever faced an unfair situation like this? Let us know in the comments, and tell us where in the world you're watching from. If you enjoyed this story and want more gripping legal battles, shocking plot twists, and stories of justice served, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring you more powerful stories. See you in the next one.